Welcome to American National Government. In this course, you will discuss the purpose, structure, and evolution of United States government.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from American Government, Roots and Reform, American Government by Lenz and Holman, and our course-assigned OpenStack's American Government textbook. This lecture focuses on delegated authority and the growth of presidential power. The core question is this: what happens when Congress keeps handing power to the presidency because action is hard, delay is costly, and legislators prefer blame avoidance to visible ownership? The core competency is to illustrate the growth of presidential powers across the past century. What happens when Congress keeps handing power to the presidency because action is hard, delay is costly, and legislators prefer blame avoidance to visible ownership? The conflict moves through emergency statutes, broad delegations, executive orders, military authorizations, and congressional reluctance to own hard choices. Americans often tell the story of presidential growth as if one ambitious office holder at a time grabbed power from a sleeping constitution. That story flatters presidents and excuses everyone else. The harder truth is more institutional. Presidents acted, yes, but Congress delegated, courts tolerated, crises accelerated, and citizens rewarded visible action. The modern presidency grew because the office offered a fast answer when other institutions looked slow, divided, or frightened. Power growth in the presidency is best understood as delegated authority under pressure. Congress writes broad emergency statutes, authorizes force, funds national security bureaucracies, and creates programs that require executive management. Presidents then operate inside that space using executive orders, emergency declarations, signing statements, military command, and administrative supervision. Critics later describe the White House as too powerful. They are often right. Yet the diagnosis remains incomplete if it ignores who built the machine and why. Congress kept handing its homework to the executive. During Depression, lawmakers needed administrative speed. During war, they wanted unified command. During national security crises, they wanted secrecy and coordination. During economic complexity, they wanted agencies that could act without rewriting statutes each week. The problem is not that delegation happened once. The problem is that repeated delegation created an office with tools so numerous and expectations so large that reclaiming legislative control now takes effort Congress seldom sustains. The civic problem is not whether executive power ever needed to expand. It plainly did at certain moments. The problem is whether a republic can keep granting emergency tools, military discretion, and administrative latitude to the presidency without quietly teaching citizens to accept permanent executive predominance as normal. The early presidency worked inside a smaller state with fewer employees, slower communication, and narrower national reach. Even then, Washington and later presidents shaped practice through precedent, especially in foreign affairs and administration. But the decisive transformation came when the scale of national problems outgrew the capacity or patience of ordinary legislative methods. The Civil War established one crucial pattern. Abraham Lincoln acted under extreme pressure, suspending habeas corpus in contested circumstances, managing war mobilization, and testing the edges of emergency authority. War made delay dangerous. War also normalized the claim that survival can justify rapid executive action. Later presidents inherited not only the constitutional text, but the example that existential crisis enlarges tolerated presidential initiative. The Great Depression deepened the pattern. Franklin Roosevelt presided over emergency banking measures, administrative experimentation, work programs, price and labor regulation, and a transformed relationship between national government and economic life. Congress passed broad statutes because it wanted action and lacked the appetite to legislate each technical choice itself. Delegation became a governing habit. The executive branch became the site where Congress's broad promise acquired operational form. Budget control added another dimension. Presidents learned that control over execution includes influence over timing, apportionment, and administrative priority even after Congress appropriates money. The Nixon-era impoundment fights made that problem explicit. If a president can decline to spend funds Congress provided, then execution starts to look like revision. Congress answered with the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, which tried to narrow unilateral spending refusal. The episode carries force because it shows executive growth did not stop at war or diplomacy. It also entered fiscal administration. World War II and the Cold War pushed growth further. Military mobilization, intelligence gathering, nuclear command, alliance management, and global posture demanded permanent structures. The National Security Act, defense appropriations, intelligence institutions, and emergency planning embedded the presidency inside a standing security state. Congress kept the power to authorize and fund, but the executive now possessed daily command over enormous capacities. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 shows the backlash phase of this cycle. After Vietnam, Congress tried to reclaim authority by requiring consultation and setting timelines for unauthorized troop deployment. That statute carries force because it admits the problem directly. Congress recognized that presidential war-making had stretched beyond what legislators considered healthy. Yet the statute also reveals Congress's weakness. Lawmakers did not end the system of executive initiative. They tried to regulate it after the machinery already existed. The precondition for later conflict was already in place by the mid-20th century. Congress repeatedly wrote statutes that turned difficult choices into executive administration. The Trading with the Enemy Act, the National Emergencies Framework, the Defense Production Act, broad appropriations for intelligence and defense, and later authorizations for military force all shared a family resemblance. They created legal shelves stocked with dormant power. Once a president invoked the triggering condition, the machinery could move faster than ordinary legislation, and often faster than Congress could reconsider its own handiwork. Delegation also grows through deadlines and technical complexity. Congress may set a broad goal, assign an agency to fill in standards, and then return years later to complain about the discretion it created. Presidents inherit those delegations and use them through executive orders, guidance, enforcement priorities, and emergency declarations. The result is a presidency enlarged by statutes written to avoid hard legislative ownership. Presidents use power growth through tools, not slogans alone. Executive orders instruct agencies how to carry out law or manage federal operations. Emergency declarations trigger statutory authorities already parked in federal law. Executive agreements let presidents conduct substantial foreign business without formal treaty ratification. Signing statements shape how presidents interpret statutory obligations at the moment of enactment. None of these instruments exist in a vacuum. Congress creates much of the background authority that makes them usable. Congress's role deserves sustained attention here. Lawmakers often prefer broad statutory language because coalitions can agree on a general aim more easily than on detailed operational choices. The Secretary shall determine. The President may waive. The agency shall issue regulations. Those phrases move the conflict downstream. They let Congress claim action while transferring difficult design and blame to the executive branch. Later, when the executive uses the delegated room aggressively, members condemn the result as overreach. Sometimes that criticism is justified. It is also often a complaint about authority Congress itself wrote. National security provides the clearest example. After Pearl Harbor, after Korea, after Vietnam, after 9/11, Congress funded and often broadened the executive security apparatus. Presidents then directed intelligence, covert action, detention policy, drone campaigns, sanctions, surveillance coordination, and military logistics through structures the legislature had helped create. The public usually sees the president because the office supplies the visible face. The deeper machine includes authorizations, appropriations, classified programs, and continuing bureaucratic routines. Emergency statutes reinforce the pattern. Congress stores authorities in law for use when presidents declare emergencies or invoke special conditions. That means power can sit dormant until a crisis, then activate quickly without new full-scale legislation. The political appeal is obvious. Lawmakers can claim readiness in advance. The constitutional danger is also obvious. Temporary emergency logic can become a standing reserve of executive options whose practical use depends far more on presidential choice than on fresh legislative deliberation. Courts add another pressure source. They rarely supervise every executive decision in real time. Cases arrive late through litigants withstanding and often after policy has already operated for months or years. That lag gives presidents room to act first. If the courts later permit the act, the precedent strengthens executive space. If the courts later strike it down, the president may already have gained political value from appearing decisive. Judicial review therefore restrains growth imperfectly because timing itself favors executive initiative. Citizens also drive the expansion. They demand visible response from presidents during attacks, recessions, disasters, and administrative breakdowns. Congress is collective and awkward on camera. Agencies look technical and diffuse. The White House can move a microphone, issue a directive, deploy a spokesperson, and announce a plan by sundown. Public demand for reassurance and responsibility therefore drives power upward, even when constitutional theory warns against it. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 reads like Congress writing a confession into statutory form. Its consultation and reporting requirements acknowledged that presidents had already been moving troops before legislators completed their own arguments. Its time limits tried to claw back initiative after deployment had begun.
Congress was not writing on a blank slate. It was trying to place legal friction on an executive habit that Vietnam had made impossible to ignore. That source tension is the heart of the document. If Congress must pass a reclaiming statute, Congress has already conceded ground. The resolution does not deny presidential command. It regulates command after movement begins, after facts accumulate, and after political costs attach to withdrawal. Presidents from both parties have treated the statute as a contested framework rather than a clean command because every practical advantage in timing points toward executive initiative first and legislative correction later. The Constitution gives both sides usable language for the fight. Presidents point to commander-in-chief authority and to the practical demands of defense, secrecy, and rapid response. Critics point to Congress's powers to declare war, raise armies, fund operations, and write rules for the military. The text does not eliminate conflict. It stages it. That is why each new emergency produces another round of argument over whether the White House is executing a delegated duty or manufacturing its own discretion. Watergate and executive privilege revealed a second front. Richard Nixon's claim of confidentiality collided with criminal process and judicial review in United States versus Nixon. The court rejected an absolute shield, but the case also showed how strongly the presidency will defend secrecy when oversight threatens survival. Executive growth, therefore, cannot be read only through patriotic emergency. Some of it grows from crisis management, some of it grows from institutional self-protection, once the office learns how useful secrecy can be. The source record points to a hard conclusion. Presidential growth does not move in one moral direction. Some expansions built capacity for real national coordination. Others weakened accountability. Some arose from open congressional delegation. Others stretched unilateral interpretation. The key question is always concrete. Which tool expanded, who authorized it, what crisis justified it, and whether the power remained after the crisis cooled. A power that survives the emergency that birthed it stops looking temporary and starts looking like constitutional weather. The modern presidency now sits at the center of a vast administrative and security machine because repeated crises taught the nation to choose speed, unity, and command. That choice carried benefits. The government can mobilize resources quickly, coordinate military action, respond to disasters, and implement broad national programs. It also carried costs. Congress struggles to reclaim initiative after delegating it. Agencies wait for White House direction, even in domains where statute gave them room. Citizens expect one office to manage problems that no single office can fully control. This is why delegated authority deserves harder scrutiny than personality. A citizen can dislike a particular president and still ignore the deeper design problem if the legal tools remain intact for the next office holder. A citizen can praise decisive crisis performance and still fail to ask whether the emergency framework now sits permanently available for less defensible uses. Institutions, remember, powers once normalized rarely disappear simply because the original crisis passes. Sunset clauses, reporting duties, reauthorization schedules, and funding renewals are the points where Congress can reclaim the homework it delegated if it still has the will. The closing question is strict. If Congress keeps giving broad discretion to the executive because action is politically easier than detail, can citizens still blame presidents alone for executive growth? Or must they judge Congress, courts, and themselves as co-authors of the machine? A mature answer will not romanticize legislative weakness. It will ask whether a republic that delegates first and regrets later has learned how to govern itself at all. The unresolved question is whether Congress can reclaim responsibility after discovering that delegation is easier than ownership.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.